All right. This is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 10, Section 3, the Nullification Crisis and the Bank War. So during Jackson's presidency, there are pretty much three major events that happen. One is the Nullification Crisis, two is the Bank War, and three, which we'll cover in the next section, is Indian policy. So we alluded a little bit to the tariff crisis previously, in that tariffs were being passed by Congress that favored the North over the South. In other words, we could say that there was Southern opposition to taxes. Tariffs, in particular, tariff is a type of tax. And that was because the North was primarily industrial. That's where most of the business was located. So a tax on foreign goods does protect American businesses, but not equally. If all those industries are in the North, then these tariffs tend to favor the North more so than the South. And it's during Jackson's presidency that this really bubbles up into a crisis, almost leading to armed conflict. So this was initiated by the state of South Carolina, which wrote an exposition and protest. This was headed by John C. Calhoun, the former vice president of Andrew Jackson, who had fallen out of favor with him. And this protest essentially was about the tariff and stated that South Carolina did not need to follow the tariff. Instead, they could follow a policy of nullification. Nullification was the policy to allow states to nullify, which pretty much means to cancel, federal laws. This was fundamentally an issue of federalism, right? So remember, federalism was one of the key tenets of the Constitution. On the one hand, there is state governments. On the other hand, there is the federal government. The federal government is passing the tariff. That tariff is then being, enforced in the states. But this time, South Carolina is saying, look, we are not going to follow it. Andrew Jackson responded to this protest by stating the Union shall be preserved. In other words, the federal government is, or has the final authority. In other words, this was a rejection of John C. Calhoun's position of nullification, stating that states can pretty much just follow whatever laws that they want. South Carolina then went through not just with the protest, but with the formal nullification of the tariff laws. So the Ordinance of Nullification, passed by the South Carolina State Legislature, formally nullified the tariff law. Again, this was called the Tariff of Abominations by Southern opponents of that law. Robert Hayne, who I believe was the governor of South Carolina, he was a vocal opponent of the tariff, a vocal supporter of states' rights, right? The right, in this case, for states to nullify. That's kind of messy. Let me clean that up. In this case, the rights for states to nullify or to cancel out laws they don't want to follow. Robert Hayne, and this is encapsulated in a debate of Robert Hayne versus Webster. There's a famous debate in American history between these two politicians. They both stand on opposite sides. Hayne stands for Southerners and states' rights. Webster stands for Northerners and really federal authority. So it's a sectional debate, North and South, but it's also a debate on the philosophy of government. Ultimately, who has the final say when it comes to determining laws, right? Hayne, Calhoun say states have the final say. Andrew Jackson and others essentially are saying, in this case, the federal government has the final say. Congress responded to this objection, South Carolina openly defying a federal law by passing the Force Bill, which permitted Jackson to use armed force. So this was becoming an especially tense situation. Jackson's, raised something like 8,000 soldiers ready to go down to South Carolina and force them to follow this law. South Carolina also called up its militia, preparing to meet the federal demand. And it looked like potentially this is happening 1832, 1833, that perhaps a brief sort of civil war might break out. In fact, if you looked at American history before the actual Civil War, this is probably the closest that the country gets to actually fighting. And this was all over tariffs. One thing that made this different, though, and this is important to note, is that in this case, South Carolina as a state stood alone, that no other states passed sort of similar nullification ordinances. And, really South Carolina didn't have the support from other southern states who this might have affected. Fast forward 30 years, in the 1860s, on the eve of the Civil War, South Carolina is once again at the center of this, sort of protest against federal authority. But they have backup from other states. 6 other states joined them in their protest. Ultimately, it did not come to blows. A compromise tariff was reached in 1833. Cooler heads prevailed. The great compromiser, of course, Henry Clay. And this was an agreement to lower the tariff over time. Over time. So this fight between, taxes on imported goods, the getting onto the verge of armed conflict, is kind of one of the major things to know about Jackson's presidency. The interesting thing about Jackson is that even though in this case Jackson was, a supporter of the Union, in this case he said the Union must be preserved, Andrew Jackson was not really he wasn't an ideologue. He didn't have a specific political ideology. He sort of did almost whatever he wanted. We'll see in other cases that Jackson ultimately favors states' rights, just sort of depending on the circumstance. A second important event that occurred during Jackson's presidency was the Bank War. The Bank War has to do with the finances, specifically around the Second National Bank of the United States. This was chartered initially in 1816, and it was set to expire in, I believe, 1832, I want to say. It might be 1834. But the Second National Bank became a symbol for many of elite corruption. If you think back to the presidency of Jackson, the corrupt bargain, the Panic of 1819, the issuing of paper money, the Second National Bank of the United States represented elite corruption for the masses. And Jackson made it his mission, really on behalf of the people that he represented, to do something about this bank. And his effort to try and dismantle it, to allow it to expire, is essentially known as the Bank War, right? The Bank War. So in the election of 1832, this was Jackson's re-election. He ran against Henry Clay. Henry Clay and his supporters wanted to recharter the National Bank. Andrew Jackson did not. So we might say Jackson Jackson says no to the recharter. Clay says yes. And ultimately in this election, Andrew Jackson won with, a pretty decent majority. And even though Congress and others tried to charter it, Jackson met that effort with a veto. If you don't recall, a veto is the power of the president. So we might say power of president to strike down. Technically, it would be a bill at that point, I believe, rather than a law. So the way that laws are passed is that Congress, the House and the Senate, they both have to pass the bill or agree to it. Once that happens, it then goes to the president's desk. The president can do two things. They can either sign it into law, which is what they do most of the time, or they can veto it. And so Jackson vetoed the recharter. This whole situation, right, between Jackson and what he believed to represent the interests of the common person and the bankers and the politicians, everybody in Congress, even Jackson's supporters, believed that it was the right decision to recharter the national bank for economic reasons. For Jackson, this was, you might say, more symbolic in some sense. You can kind of get an idea of how this was portrayed in America at the time. Here you have Andrew Jackson at the center, and he's battling this sort of many-headed hydra of bankers and politicians and all these other elites. Jackson supporters referred to it as the monster bank, and in this case, it was killed by Jackson. This wasn't the end of the bank war, even though it would not be rechartered. There was still some back and forth between Andrew Jackson and other members associated with the bank. Jackson passed the specie circular. If you'll recall, specie is gold and silver. Jackson essentially said must be used to buy land. The banks wanted to use paper money, which was used before. It was partially to blame for the Panic of 1819. Jackson didn't trust paper money. Jackson did things like pull the money out of the national bank and put it in state banks instead. Ultimately, this back and forth, even though the monster bank was killed, and so Jackson was celebrated by, really his supporters for having taken out this institution of elite corruption, and ultimately did lead to the Panic of 1837, which was, of course, an economic depression. That didn't happen during Jackson's presidency, but instead happened during the presidency of his successor, Martin Van Buren. Now, through all this, especially in terms of his opposition to the national bank, Andrew Jackson gained some opponents. Those, called themselves the Whigs. So the Whigs, we'll say, is a rival political party to Jackson. And they called themselves the Whigs because Whigs were people in England who were opposed to the king. And the accusation against Andrew Jackson was that he was acting like a king. They called him King Andrew. And this was really because the use of his veto. This illustration here sort of best represents the way that the opponents of Andrew Jackson would have portrayed him, that he was denying Congress the ability to pass laws by constantly using the veto, not just to recharter the national bank, but also to, Andrew Jackson used the veto more so than any other president in United States history up to that point. So with that, essentially was born the second party system, which pitted the Democrats, which was a new political party at the time, supporters of Andrew Jackson, versus the Whigs, who were opponents of Andrew Jackson. And because this dichotomy was set up over just this man, one man, you had some very strange bedfellows on this side. So, for example, people like John C. Calhoun, defender of the South, defender of slavery, was on the same side as a person like John Quincy Adams, who was from the North, really about as close to an abolitionist president as you had at that time. The one thing they had in common was that they were both from the elite political class, and they both opposed Andrew Jackson.